G'day and welcome to Southeast Queensland, Australia. Quite a nice area with some pretty nice driving roads that are perfectly suited for a car of this sort, which is a Peugeot 306 GTi-6. It's actually my example. I've owned it for about 4 years, so I figured what better day to take it out on the road and show you what it's like to drive as an owner. Now, looks are entirely subjective, but I quite like the way the 306 looks. It's got a nice large glass area, clean and subtle lines, and very nice looking rims with a slight dish to them. The colour contrasts really well with the rest of the car, especially at night. It's a design that, in my opinion, has aged very well and is still relevant today, even nearly 30 years later. The inside is typical French build quality, so not really the best. However, the gauge cluster is really easy to read, and the controls are fairly easy to use and pretty sensibly laid out. So enough talking about the looks. What is it actually like to drive? Quite good. The engine's very nice, and in my opinion quite an overlooked aspect of this car actually. It's only a 2-litre naturally aspirated unit making just under 170 horsepower and just under 200 newton meters, but it's the way it delivers its power which is actually surprisingly nice. It's got a lot of very usable low down torque thanks to very long intake manifold runners. And the horsepower starts to creep in really nicely and very progressively up until the rev limiter. It doesn't run to the red line like an old Honda does or something like that, but it's a very, very progressive power delivery. And because there's no variable valve timing on this engine, there's no exact moment or an exact switch where all of a sudden you have an extra kick of power. There's no exact moment that occurs. It's just continuously building throughout the rev range, all the way up until the 7,500 RPM in the middle, so it sounds quite nice too. Another aspect of the engine I really like is the snappy throttle response. Sure, it doesn't have the power of a turbocharged hot hatch of today, but it has such a snappy throttle response that makes the engine seem so keen and enthusiastic. There's no lag. The gear change is actually quite nice. It's not super mechanical or super precise, but definitely not rubbery. And while the throws are a little bit longer than what I think most people would like, certainly not that bad. The brakes are very nicely judged, not over servoed at all. Once again, it's a light car, so they don't really need to be. And there is quite a lot of pedal travel, but you get a great level of modulation all throughout the brake pedal and a very progressive, gradually building bite all the way down. And at the very end of pedal travel, there is definitely a lot of braking force. So it's definitely not under braked, it's just not as responsive as a modern car would be. But the pedal feel and the modulation really makes up for that, I reckon. So getting onto some more exciting bits of road now. First things first, the steering. It's not as particularly reactive or as quick as you might expect from sort of a car this light, but what it is beautifully judged with a very nice combination of feel but also assistance. Now, it's obviously not a very heavy car, so it doesn't need that much hydraulic assistance, and because it is a little bit on the slower side, you can be very precise with it, because each degree of lock that you apply gives you a very, very linear progressively start to build over the front axle. Front end is very stubborn. No signs of understeer unless you're asking for it. Not going to find them on the public road, at least. There's a very nice amount of road feel. Obviously, it's not a very heavy car, so there doesn't need to be that much hydraulic assistance. So that in turn really gives you such a good idea of what the front end's doing. The best bit about this car though is its chassis, which isn't really a surprise considering that Peugeots were so famous for that. First of all, the turn-in. Brilliant for any car, let alone a front-wheel drive. This is probably aided by the fact it's got a 30-degree slanted engine towards the firewall, which keeps a bit of weight towards the middle of the car. But then you've got its balance and how you can essentially steer the car with your right foot. You stay on the throttle and the car feels very planted and very secure. Then you can come off the throttle quickly and of course experience Peugeot's famous and perhaps feared lift-off oversteer. Then you've got the best bit, the bit that I love doing the most. You come into the corner and you come off the throttle a little bit and you feel the front end tuck into the apex, and then the rear wanting to come around, but it doesn't quite. It sort of holds this beautiful knife edge balance that just feels so satisfying, and that is by far the best way to drive this car, I think. And following from that, dimensionally the car is very small, so it is so easy to place on the road that you have so much room in the lane to experiment with lines. You can actually aim for an apex, which you can't really do in cars that are so much wider, especially on narrow roads like this. You're always nervous about where the front wheels are, but in this you've got no issues with that. You always know where they are, and you've got a lot of adjustability within the lane thanks to those dimensions. You also feel really central to the pivot point of the car. Pivots around you very nicely. It feels like you're right in the middle, and that's thanks to its passive rear wheel steering, which isn't a gimmick. It's actually very noticeable and quite nice. It's different. Body roll, well contained. There's not much. There is a little bit at slow speed corners, and you can feel the outside, or inside rather, wheels starting to kick up and tripod a little bit, but otherwise there's not a lot there. And because the car's so light, there's not a lot of weight transfer, which means even if you're not pushing on at 10/10ths, you can get into this really rhythmic, beautiful flow and fluidity with the chassis, which is very nice. It's not isolated even at low speeds, so you don't have to be driving this car hard to really enjoy that chassis. A left-hand turn down a slightly bumpier road gives me the chance to talk about one of my favourite parts of this car. The damping. That's another thing Peugeot were very well known for. The GTi-6 has quite long travel suspension. Definitely not a track setup, but on the road, especially bumpy roads like this, it works so well, and at no point feels soft or floaty. The progression of the compression is very nice and very progressive and very well judged, and then the rebound is super fast. So over really consistent bumps and ridges and so forth on torn up bits of road, the suspension works so quick, and you can feel it working underneath you, but there's very little interference coming through the chassis. And even at the limit of travel, the bump stops are hydraulic, so it's not as dramatic as a stop as it is in other cars. And what this means is the car always feels so composed that that beautiful Peugeot chassis balance I was talking about can still be enjoyed, because the bumps don't distract the nose from its chosen line, and nor do they distract the rear and cause unwanted oversteer. The suspension works on your side to keep the rest of the chassis so in check. And in the real world, on back roads like this, it's quite important. There's nothing worse than having a car that feels nervous and feels skady over bumps. And it just goes to show that when the rest of the body is well controlled, long travel suspension, when it's set up properly, works so well in the real world. It just does. Roads aren't racetracks. Unless you live somewhere where they are beautifully smooth all the time, you need suspension. And this car really, really does showcase that. Now let's also not forget that the GTi-6 is from an era well before adaptive damping, so it's a one setting, one size fits all package. It's a reminder of what good old suspension tuning feels like. Now, the point of today's drive isn't to say that there isn't such thing as a modern hot hatch worth owning. I'd love a Focus RS or a Civic Type R. But modern hatches with their track focus setups make them so much more powerful and capable around a track, but on the road more remote and sanitised, and less exploitable. Their limits are so much harder to reach, and they do lack the engagement and feel that you get from something this era, and the sense of fun. I think that the late 90s and early 2000s were a wonderfully balanced era of driving, with cars that were already modern enough to be comfortable and refined, but old enough to lack the age and technology that the modern market demands cars have, as well as the extra size and increased weight that comes with that. The 306 GTi-6 never had that problem, and in turn what you get is a driving experience that, even though it is a bit of a cliche, is analogue and is raw. It's got excellent road holding that doesn't leave you wanting more in the way of grip levels, but limits that are still accessible. It feels so transparent, and it's a back to basics driving experience that reminds petrolheads why we love driving. So there you go. I hope not only was I able to show you what a GTi-6 is like to drive, but also remind you of a time where cars were so much simpler, before there was all this technology, safety, convenience, making its way into cars, increasing weight and size. This car is a very back to basics driving experience before all of that, and it's a reminder that this car's from an era that will probably no longer exist.